Let me make sure this little gizmo is on. And so it is. Thank you for those kind words, and thanks to all of you for allowing me to spend some time with you today. What I'd like to do in my time is to put 8 key thoughts on the table that will suggest to you some of the ways that I think about greener, healthier towns and cities, and that I hope will have some resonance with you as well. Now, one of those is just for fun. You'll know that one when we come to it, but the others are more serious. Before I do that, I want to get a little bit into the title of my talk today, which is also the title of my book. Thank you for mentioning that. People habitat. To me, the phrase carries 2 important concepts. One is that people come first in the phrase, as I believe they must come first in our thinking. Now, I'm an environmentalist. I worked 33 years for an environmental group. I feel very strongly about environmental issues. But if our solutions don't work for people, they're never going to work for the planet. So I put people first. Now, habitat is more of an environmental word. Habitat conjures the field of ecology. And in studying ecology, we learn that for an ecosystem to be healthy, its component parts must be healthy, and they must fit together in a healthy and harmonious way. That's true for natural habitat. I think it's also true for the built environment that we create for people. Our homes, our shops, our workplaces, our schools, our neighborhoods, our cities and towns, our metropolitan regions have to be themselves healthy and have to fit together in a healthy and harmonious way in order for the people habitat ecosystem to be healthy. Now, unfortunately, for many of the last several decades, the way that we have been creating our built environment is not healthy and harmonious at all. As we have allowed our countryside increasingly to be paved over, and at the same time, we have allowed so many of our older communities and neighborhoods to decline and be disinvested. I see our job as stewards of people habitat in the 21st century, in large measure, as being to avoid the mistakes of the past and to correct them where we can. Now, with that in mind, let me get to my 8 points. The first one is that although I want us to think about healthy towns and cities, I think it's important that we not just think about towns and cities when we do so. I think we need to think both larger and smaller. And in particular, I would urge us to think about regions and about neighborhoods. Those are, I believe, the 2 most important scales for thinking about sustainable communities. We need to think about regions, in part because our cities and towns, our jurisdictional lines don't confine the way that we actually live today. They certainly don't confine environmental media. We're looking here at the city limits of Atlanta, superimposed on a satellite photo of what I believe to be the real Atlanta, many times larger in both size and area. And if we look up close at those city limits, I don't know if they make sense to you, but they certainly don't make any sense to me. Maybe there's some legal or taxation reason why those lines were drawn the way that they were. But that's not the way that we actually live today. And here in Sarasota County, some of your own lines, I think, look a little arbitrary when you see them on a map. Here's a neighborhood that's not far from my home. This is about between 3 and 4 miles from my house. Notice how it looks like a fairly typical and harmonious neighborhood. All the houses are red brick colonials with black shutters and white doors, and the vehicles look more or less the same throughout this photo, and the vegetation looks the same. I assure you that the socioeconomic class of people that live throughout this photo is the same. But everything you see on the left side of the street is in the jurisdiction of Washington, D.C., and everything you see on the right side of the street is in the jurisdiction of the state of Maryland. Now, we can't think about how green and healthy this place is if we think about it one side of the street at a time. I like to joke that city limits have enduring relevance to cartographers and to candidates for public office, but they don't have much relevance to things like air, water, energy, transportation, commerce, or people. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit to make a point. Jurisdictions are important, particularly municipalities are important because they remain important politically. And we need to work with and within jurisdictions to get things done. But I think it's important that we remember the place of our cities and towns within their larger regions when we do so. Now remember, I said that I think we also need to think smaller. We need to think about neighborhoods because neighborhoods are where we encounter our environment on an everyday basis. And neighborhoods are also where we encounter each other. If metropolitan regions represent the economic scale of people habitat, the neighborhoods represent the human and personal scale. Neighborhoods are also where increments of change take place. So neighborhoods are where we have to pay attention. And neighborhoods are where we can make a difference. So that's point one about regions and neighborhoods. Point two is a different kind of point. Americans don't walk much, and I don't blame them. When I say we don't walk much, the numbers really bear me out. This is a survey of 17 nations that was published by National Geographic. We Americans come in dead last in the amount of walking that we do. The Canadians, despite their colder weather, walk significantly more than we do. The Brits walk twice as much as we do. The Brazilians, when they're not dancing at the world's greatest parties, walk a lot more than we do. But why would we expect anybody to walk when we have been creating environments in which walking is inherently inconvenient and unsafe? The only people who walk in an environment like this are people without choices. What I find so distressing about this photograph is not just that the poor woman can't get across the street, but that it looks like so much of America. Let me ask a question. How many of us, when we were kids, walked or rode a bike to school? How many of us now have kids, or if we're old enough, grandkids who walk or ride a bike to school? Notice the difference. And statistically, there's a big difference as well. In 1969, about half of school kids walked to school. 40 years later, that number was down to 13%. But why would we expect anybody to walk to a school like this? This is a high school in Northern Virginia. Its campus is twice as big as Disneyland. The parking lots take up more space than the classrooms, and there is nothing remotely close enough, and I'm afraid remotely is the correct word, to walk to or from, even if someone were so inclined. While we're on the subject of walkable schools, I can't resist saying a little bit about the architecture that we seem to be giving so many of our newer schools today. This high school in suburban Chicago was under construction when I pulled this image off of the web. Now, normally when architects make renderings, they want to make them look as good as possible, right? So we have to assume that this is as good as this particular school is ever going to look. Now, to me, there's nothing about this building that says it's a place of learning, it's a place of nurture, it's a place of importance to the community. And I contrast that with the more traditional high school that we see, which is in New Hampshire, by the way, which was given an architecture that indicated its importance to the community. I think we need to get back to that. Now, I'm not going to argue that our lack of walking is the only reason, or even necessarily the most significant reason, why we have an epidemic of obesity in this country. But the research shows that it is an important contributing reason. We've gone in a generation from a country in which no state had an obesity rate of even 20% to a country in which every state has an obesity rate greater than 20%. Most have a rate greater than 25, and quite a few have a rate greater than 30. And if we look just at adult Americans, fully 1/3 of us can now be considered obese, according to the Surgeon General's report that came out in September. As we've gained in body weight, we've gained almost some exact same trajectory in weight-related disease, including type 2 diabetes. So one thing we need to do is to create more walk-friendly environments, and here are some ways to do this. The research teaches us that the most significant indicator statistically of how much walking takes place in a neighborhood is how well connected the street network is. And here you see why. When streets are well connected, then walking routes become shorter. And when they become shorter, more people walk. We can also sometimes avoid walking on the busy roads in order to get to where we want to go. We also need good infrastructure for walking. Sidewalks, anybody? Complete streets. We need traffic to move at appropriate speeds. And we need things to walk to within walking distance. The research also shows that when there is retail within safe and comfortable walking distance of homes, that residents of that walkable neighborhood will weigh on average 10 pounds less than residents of a conventional suburban neighborhood that is basically driving only, even when you tease out other factors such as age, ethnicity, and income. So that's point 2 about walking. Point 3 is dear to my heart. Communities need nature. This is also, by the way, the point in my presentation that I consider to be my shameless slide, because this is where I'm going to plug my book. I'm only going to do this once in the course of the talk, so bear with me. I want to read just a couple of sentences from the book to set up this part of the discussion. It's from a chapter in the book called Cities Need Nature, and it goes like this. In cities, the presence of nature connects us with growth and with the seasons, providing a softness to complement the concrete of our streets and sidewalks and the brick and wood of our houses. Who among us has not enjoyed a stroll, ridden a bike, read a book or magazine, learned a sport, fallen in love, or otherwise enjoyed the communion with nature provided by a lovely city park? Speaking of lovely city parks, this is one of my favorites. This is a place called Russell Square. It's in London. And if you know London, it's just steps away from the British Museum. As you can see, it's gorgeous. One of the things I like about Russell Square is that it's 8 acres in size, which is small enough so that you know you're still inside a city when you're there, and you can also reach it by foot from a lot of places in the city. But it's big enough so that you know that you can get inside a very special place. And in the case of Russell Square, you know that that very special place is in London because they have a cafe that serves really good tea and scones. As much as I like parks like Russell Square, I love neighborhood-scaled parks like Elm Street Park in suburban Maryland. This is only 1.5 acres in size. Look where it's located. Just to its west, do I have a laser pointer on this? Maybe not, doesn't matter. Just to its west is a busy commercial corridor, and just to its east is a neighborhood of single-family homes. Elm Street Park draws from both sides and serves as a buffer between the two. I love Elm Street Park. We can go smaller still. This is a children's park that was made from a vacant lot in Boston. The neighborhood is called Codman Square. I had the honor of doing some work there a few years ago. And one of the things that I love about this park, which is called Elmhurst Park, is that the kids made these signs that they put up around the perimeter of the park, which I think is really cool. The parks aren't the only way in which we should be bringing nature into our cities and our towns. We're looking here at Hartford, Connecticut. The name of the street, appropriately enough, is Capitol Avenue. It runs in the direction of the Connecticut State Capitol, which you can see in the background of the photo with its golden dome. Hartford has a plan to turn Capitol Avenue from a street that looks like this into a street that's going to look like this. Notice the difference the street trees make. Notice how at the end of the road, I've got my own laser pointer. You see what looks like a garden of some sort. Perhaps it's a rain garden, perhaps it's a food garden. And notice how in the parking bays and crosswalks, we have not just smooth concrete or asphalt, but we have pavers, we have individual stones that allow stormwater to seep through and recharge the groundwater aquifer, rather than becoming polluted runoff, clogging sewers and contaminating receiving waterways. So we have not just the beauty of nature, but the function of nature coming to Capitol Avenue in Hartford. Here's how we can do something like that in an older residential neighborhood. And here's how we can even do it in an alley. This is my favorite pair of slides in the whole talk. Isn't that amazing? Bringing the beauty and function of nature into our communities. Now, the functions of nature are many. I'm not going to go through them all. But I do want to make special mention of the public health benefits of nature, because the literature is particularly robust when it comes to the public health benefits. In nature, our blood pressure goes down and our mental acuity goes up. Those are two reasons why I need to spend more time in community nature. Okay, point 4 is another kind of point. In point 4, I'm going to get a little wonky and technical. Bear with me, though, because I think it's an important point. What seems green may not really be so green. Or a green development in the wrong place won't necessarily have green performance. That's because the environmental characteristics of a building or development are not just limited to what goes on inside the development, but also consists of the traffic that that building or development generates. And in most cases, the traffic is actually the more important factor environmentally. What this chart is showing is that we use more energy and thus emit more carbon getting to and from an average office building than the average office building itself uses and emits. Now, where this gets really interesting is in the geography of carbon emissions. We're looking here at a map, but it's a special kind of map. This is a map of the small city in western North Carolina where I grew up. This is Asheville. Some of you may know it. Asheville now has a reputation for being a hip and trendy place. I grew up there in the 1960s. Church socials were sort of where it was at the time. But what I want you to notice about this map is the color coding. Now, this white area is national forest land, so it doesn't count in the analysis. The light colors are where households on average have low rates of carbon emissions per capita for transportation. The dark colors are where households have relatively high rates of carbon emissions per capita for transportation. Notice how the low carbon places are located in the center of the region. This is Asheville and Buncombe County. And it's out on the fringe where we get the higher rates. The reason for that is that central locations shorten driving distances on average. Outer locations lengthen driving distances on average. There are other reasons as well, but Asheville's kind of the place where everybody drives. And statistically, that's the most significant reason. It's all about driving distances. Now, Asheville is a relatively simple place. By the way, I've looked at 50 maps of metro regions across the country, and they all have more or less the same pattern, with the central areas of the region having low carbon rates and the outer parts of the region having high carbon rates. This is Chicago, which is a much more complex place than Asheville. But notice again how the pattern is similar. The blue area is Lake Michigan. This is the Chicago Loop right here. And as you get inner city Chicago and the inner suburbs, we have relatively light colors. You get to the outer areas, we have relatively dark colors, meaning there are high rates of carbon emissions per capita. Notice something also that's fairly interesting about this map of Metro Chicago. Some of the outlying communities have their own patterns. Look here at Aurora. It's got a little light pattern in the center. Or look at Elgin or Joliet, where you see that. So a place can have more than one center. And my impression looking quickly at the Google Earth maps of Sarasota County is that Sarasota County is a place with more than one center. What all of this means about the geography of carbon emissions is that one of the greenest things that we can do is to strengthen and reinvest in the cores of our communities. Here we see on the left senior housing in Boston. On the right we see a revitalized Main Street in Southern California. Now I brought up Chicago because I want to illustrate the point with reference to a particular development. Prairie Ridge Estates is doing a lot of things right environmentally. You see here in the photograph a wind turbine in the background. There are solar panels on many of the houses. Renewable energy is being generated on site, and as a result, the developer is able to say that the homes are net zero, meaning that they use no more energy and emit no more carbon than is generated on site in the form of non-polluting renewables. That is a very good thing, and Prairie Ridge deserves to be applauded for it. However, when we look at where it's located, 40 miles from the Chicago Loop, across the road from farmland, we see that its environmental performance is compromised by its location. And if we look closely at the numbers, we see that residents of Prairie Ridge emit 4 times as much carbon for transportation as do residents of downtown Chicago. They emit twice as much carbon for transportation as do residents of the Chicago region as a whole. So what seems green may not actually have green performance unless we think about where we put it. This is the point that's just for fun. Remember I said there would be one that's just for our amusement. Don't take me too seriously on this one. It's called Don't Trust the Name. But I think sometimes that we name places not so much for what they are, but to obscure what they are. And in many cases, they end up really being kind of the opposite of what the name would suggest. We're looking here at a lovely town square. This is a town center with no town. When I say that it has no town, that's actually literally true in this case. It's in Loudoun County, Virginia, but it's not in any incorporated area within the county. The road leading from the highway to the shopping mall there is called City Center Boulevard, which I think is particularly bold, considering that there's no city, there's no center, and it's not a boulevard. There's something sad about shopping malls right now, by the way. The shopping malls peaked, really. The heyday of shopping malls in the U.S. was the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and some of them are fading today. I find that a little bit sad in some ways. Here's Central Park. This is in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Once I started collecting these things, I couldn't stop myself. You know, it just got away from me, I think. I'm not sure if this one's even possible. It's been a long time since I took geometry class, you know, but I just don't know. Then there's the wonderful habit of naming subdivisions after the things that they replace. But every now and then, a little truth in nomenclature creeps out, and we name places for exactly what they are, as in the case of this subdivision in Utah. Okay, that's the part that's for fun. Great places have respect for legacy. This is also very dear to my heart. I think we've all had the experience of going by a place that's been drastically altered and finding ourselves somewhat disoriented by that. We can't get our bearings. I know that I sometimes can't even remember what the old building looked like, even though it was there 2 weeks ago. It's sort of odd that way. The opposite of that comes with something that I call continuity of place. When we allow our places to change gradually and incrementally over time, it has a calming and reassuring feeling. I also think that it provides connective tissue between generations and among different members of the current society. Now, related to continuity of place, but a little different, is something I call cultural engagement. I want to illustrate the point with reference to a place called Glen Echo Park. I'm an avid bicyclist, and I do fitness rides from my house in D.C. out into Maryland and back. This Glen Echo comes at mile 23 of a 30-mile ride. And by the time I get to Glen Echo, I'm quite ready to take a break, and I do, almost every time. Now, Glen Echo, as you may guess from the photo, was once an amusement park. It was built in the Art Deco era. You see the carousel there behind the tree. The carousel still runs in season, by the way. Kids love the place. And several other buildings are preserved now. The place is now owned by the National Park Service and is run by a contractor. But Glen Echo Park is no longer an amusement park, but it's an evocation of one. And because our older places evoke what they were, or in some cases, what they might be with adaptation, they invite us to bring our imagination with us to the experience of being there. I call that cultural engagement. Older neighborhoods also tend to have more vitality than newer neighborhoods. This is a neighborhood in Milwaukee. The National Trust has research showing that neighborhoods with a diversity of building sizes, in other words, small, medium, and large buildings, and a diversity of building ages, both old and new, score better on a range of civic vitality indicators than do more uniform and newer neighborhoods. Finally, our older places carry with them some environmental advantages as well. When we're able to recycle buildings and recycle infrastructure, we don't have to spend again the materials and energy that go into the construction of the building. National Trust also has research showing that if an older building is demolished and replaced with a newer one, even if the newer one is constructed to greener standards, that it'll take decades for any kind of green dividend to show up from that replacement because of all of the energy that is expended and all of the carbon that is emitted in the demolition and construction of the building. Now, that said about greener buildings and the fact that many newer buildings can be built to greener standards doesn't mean that we can't convert older buildings to greener standards as well, and that's what the photograph on the right is showing us. That's a house in Ann Arbor, Michigan. It really is net zero because it's in a walkable neighborhood in the heart of Ann Arbor. It's built in the 1890s. It's net zero for energy, and it's also net zero for water. Point 7. Even though I think it's important that we honor our past, it's also important that we recognize that the future is going to be different from the past. And some of those differences, I think, are significant and actually favorable to sustainability. For one thing, we're not sprawling as much as we were. Sometimes that's hard to fathom when we see new sprawl going up. We actually peaked in the amount of newly developed land that we built in the mid-1990s, and it's been going down ever since. We're also not driving as much on a per capita basis as we once did. What this graph is showing, I know this is really wonky, this graph, is that except for periods of recession, where we would expect driving to go down and then pop back up, which it did, we had a very steep increase in driving rates per capita in the 1970s and 1980s. By the late 1990s, the growth began to flatten a bit. It peaked in 2005, started going down before the Great Recession, continued to go down after the Great Recession. Now, it did tick back up just in the last year with increase in gas prices. But I don't think we're going back to the sort of steep increases in driving that we saw in the 1970s and 1980s. And that's because the millennial generation has some very different preferences about lifestyle than their predecessor generations have had. Define millennials more or less as people who were born in the last 2 decades of the 20th century. It's the largest generation in American history. It's going to dominate America statistically for the next several decades. And if we look at their housing preferences, we start to see some differences. Millennials are twice as likely to prefer living in a core city as are members of other generations. Even if they prefer to live in a suburb or a small town, they want walkability. 71% want to live within walking distance of destinations. 78% are seeking diversity. This is a generation that grew up with more diversity than its predecessors and has come to expect it. And interestingly, at the same time that many millennials are seeking walkable neighborhoods in which to live, a lot of baby boomers are downsizing. And a lot of baby boomers are looking for walkable environments too. My friend Lori Volk, who is a terrific market analyst, calls this the great convergence of the 2 largest generations in American history, both with large numbers seeking walkable environments at the same time. And if we look at transportation habits, we also see some differences. I don't know about you, but when I turned 16 years old, it was the happiest day of my life because I could finally get my driver's license. This was a big deal to a kid growing up in North Carolina, and everybody that I knew felt exactly the same way. Well, today, 30% of 19-year-olds don't even have a driver's license. And if you count 16 through 19-year-olds, that number goes up to 38%. That's a change. Contrast that to the 1980s, and only 13% of 19-year-olds did not have a driver's license. Miles driven per capita by ages 16 through 30 dropped 25% in a recent 15-year period. And millennials are twice as likely to use public transit as are baby boomers. I think it's those communities that understand these demographic changes and these changes in preferences, that are going to be best able to hang on to their young people as they mature and are going to be best positioned for success in the coming decades. And this brings me to my last point, and I would argue that it's the most important point. Gertrude Stein famously said of Oakland, California, "There is no there there." Now, that wouldn't be fair to say about Oakland today. There's some cool things going on in Oakland right now. But we all sort of know what she meant, because we know places that don't have a there, that don't have intrinsic value. There's nothing special about this place. There's nothing that tells us it's a place that's distinctive from other places. It could be anywhere USA. It happens to be suburban San Diego. And I argue instead that we need to create the kinds of places that people love. Now, I know that lovability is a mushy word. I know that it's difficult to measure, but that does not make it unimportant, because it is the places that we love that will be cared for and will be sustained over time. It doesn't do any good to have a sustainable place if it's not sustained. If we throw it away in 20 years, it's not really going to have the environmental benefits that it was designed to have. So I want to run through some slides of some places that I think are lovable, and you can think about places in your own community that you find lovable or that you think could be lovable with some improvement. A lovable place can be very complex. This is Quincy Market in Boston. Or it can be also very simple. This is an ice cream shop in Camden, Maine, population about 5,000. It can be a place of architectural harmony and human scale, such as this neighborhood in Miami. It can be a place that celebrates local culture. No big city in America does that better than New Orleans, where I took this particular photo. Here's a place that was saved because it was loved. This is Broad Branch Market, about 2 miles from my house in DC. It's across the street from an elementary school, and it's within a residential neighborhood of mostly single-family homes. When the owners of Broad Branch Market reached retirement age, they put the building up for sale. The neighbors became so concerned that they were going to lose the asset that they loved, that they actually banded together, worked with the bank, worked with the sellers in order to keep the sale open long enough so that a buyer could be found who would maintain the market as a market. And as a matter of fact, the buyer didn't just maintain the market, the buyer improved it. And as you can see in this photo, Broad Branch Market is absolutely flourishing today. And this brings me to the last slide. And this is another image of the town where I grew up, Asheville, North Carolina. It's a mixture of old and new. In the background, we see Asheville City Hall, which was built in the 1930s. And in the foreground, we see a plaza that was just built in the last decade on what used to be surface parking, giving that part of downtown Asheville a place that people can love. And as you can see, people do love it. This photograph also illustrates something that I call the indicator species for people habitat. In studying ecology, we learn to estimate or indicate the health of an ecosystem by looking to the health of particular species within that ecosystem. If we want to indicate the health of a river, we may look at a particular species of fish. If we want to indicate the health of a forest, we may look at a particular species of bird. For people habitat, kids and elders make great indicator species. If kids and elders flock to a place, love a place, then chances are we have a place with it there. We have great people habitat. And I thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to the rest of the day.
Okay, we want to say thank you, but don't go anywhere, because if you have a question to ask, we are going to ask you to hold your hand up with the card, and we'll come around and get it. And then you're going to come back up. I'm going to ask you the questions, and we'll get to answer them. Where's the on button? Hey, Hayes, I don't know how to turn that on. Okay. All right, we're going to share this microphone. And let me grab my glasses. After this, we're going to take a break, so just hang on just a few minutes. We'll give everybody the chance to stretch. Okay, the first question is from Juliana. Regarding the maps of the carbon emissions from transportation, the map of carbon emissions from transportation are specifically referring to where the residents who emit the carbon live, right? Not where the carbon is emitted. I ask because there is a perception that inner city traffic is more congested, the population is more concentrated, and thus geographically there is more carbon emitted in the inner city.
Is this on? Yeah. It's true that there is a difference between places where carbon is emitted and places where carbon is emitted per capita. But in order to understand the health of a region and to understand the effect that we are giving to the emission of carbon emissions overall, we need to look at the region as a whole. And in order to reduce carbon emissions from the region as a whole, we need to locate carbon in particular. I mean, we need to locate development in low carbon places.
All right, next question. How can agriculture play into sustainable communities? That's the first one.
Agriculture can play a great role in sustainable communities, really in two ways. One is regionally, because I think that our regions are interconnected in that our built environment places are intertwined or interconnected really with our more rural landscape. The reason people want to come to the places where we have built environment is frequently because of the beauty and the productivity of the landscape that surrounds them. So agriculture plays a role in that. Increasingly, and this is a really neat thing in the last decade or so, agriculture is playing a role inside neighborhoods. I didn't mention it, but I showed a slide of a community garden in St. Louis. And I think community gardens are popping up all over the place, and I think it's a wonderful asset for neighborhoods when they do.
All right, got a little more for you. How can a community provide an economic incentive to make drastic changes?
The question assumes that the changes that we should be making are drastic, and I don't necessarily buy that. I think that incremental changes are important, and we shouldn't discount the importance of incremental changes. Now, economically, a lot of things could change. We do a lot right now to subsidize sprawl. We give tax breaks to companies that locate in sprawling areas. We subsidize their highways, and we don't provide comparable subsidies for reinvesting in our older neighborhoods and communities, and I think we should.
All right, Derek asks, how do airports' proximity impact carbon emissions? And did the map of Chicago show an airport on the lower edge?
The map of Chicago showed 3 airports, Airports are, or we need to think more broadly. Air travel is fairly polluting. I mean, that's just happens to be the case. And some of us who travel partially for our living, I think, feel a little guilt about that in some ways. It may, I haven't really seen the numbers to see how flying per passenger mile compares to other forms of travel, but travel does pollute. There's no question about that, and airports are part of that equation. I think one thing that can be done is high-speed rail, and I know there have been several proposals and initiatives for high-speed rail in the country. I think in Florida you had one that was ultimately rejected, unfortunately. High-speed rail is a good way of cutting down on some of those air emissions.
Okay, I have a question that Steve provides. I'm not exactly sure where he's going with it, but it's simple. Are you familiar with UTC?
No.
Steve, do you want to follow up with that?
In regards to the model of malls being outdated in Sarasota County University.
Yeah, we just built a mall recently. They obviously didn't get your message of how they're going out of date. But since you haven't seen it, do you want to comment?
The good news nationally, if not perhaps yet in Sarasota County, is that we are closing more malls than we are building each year. I think that one of the more interesting challenges and opportunities is what to do with our malls when they close. We've seen some great examples where they've been converted into more sustainable places, and we've also seen some poor examples where they just become community eyesores and sit there for a long time. I hope that doesn't become the ultimate fate of UTC.
Can I ask a question on that, though? When you, the one thing that the malls do is it brings everybody to a central location for a lot of shopping. So I'm going to take it a step further and say that they're closing probably because we're getting our goods in other ways via the internet or other things, which as far as sustainability goes, I don't know if that's actually better. Because then you bring in air travel and trucks and everything else. So is there a better solution, or is this just the way of the future?
Well, there's still airplanes and trucks that go into delivering goods to and from a mall. So a mall doesn't really do away with that form of transportation, and actually the drivers of delivery trucks for package handling are fairly efficient, and that those trucks are full and choose geographically efficient routes when they do so. Maybe I'm kind of both old-fashioned and sort of hopefully new-fashioned in that I really like old-fashioned shopping districts that are outdoors and where we can walk around and have a sense that we're in a place and that we're not just in an enclosed artificial environment. And I hope that for those businesses that do have a continuing need for foot traffic, that we will move more in that direction than in the direction of enclosed malls.
All right, Jay asked the first question, what is the appropriate regional scale for our area?
I would think that the appropriate scale is to have development in concentrated clusters and not spread out all across the county.
And what is the distance, what distance is reasonable for someone to walk to the store? In Florida, is this reduced to the, because of heat? I guess the environment.
Yeah, maybe so, and that's one reason why street trees are so important. There's research on how far people will walk to various things. People will typically walk a quarter mile to most destinations. To special destinations, they'll walk half a mile. But my friend Steve Mouzon, who's an architectural thinker of some importance, I think, has a different theory. His theory is that places have different levels of what he calls walk appeal, and that we'll walk farther if the route along which we are walking is more interesting and conducive to walk. So if we make places more beautiful and more hospitable, and his illustration is that in Rome, he'll happily walk 2 miles and not think twice about it. But in the suburbs near his home, he's not going to walk even 1/8 of a mile. He's going to get in his car and drive
Sure.
from one place to another.
Rob asked, how do we influence developers to provide more environmentally friendly communities that blend into the natural landscape?
What a great question. Well, I mean, planning and zoning, as technical and boring as planning and zoning can be, are really important. And I think it's important to start with a vision and to go through the process of allowing the community to set its own vision for what the community can become. And in most cases, what we see is that communities really want to do the right thing. They don't want their communities to be screwed up and ugly and inefficient. And so after that vision reaches some sort of consensus, then you need a zoning code to implement it. And I noticed here in Sarasota County, for instance, you have a form-based code, which is a progressive kind of zoning that allows for mixed-use walkable development to be built in places where that's appropriate. And I think with regard to the natural environment, what we most need to do is to avoid transgressing it. And again, concentrating development, I think, rather than allowing development to sprawl out is important.
Dale asked, do you encourage consolidation such as when the city of Jacksonville, Florida expanded and took over the entire county? Sounds political to me.
I don't know. My guess is that if you look at places that have done that, I think Nashville has done a form of that, Indianapolis has done a form of that. I don't know if anybody's actually measured the results to see if it's made a difference or not. That's not something that I'm expert in.
All right. Do you endorse traffic calming devices such as speed bumps when under the tenets of new urbanism, traffic is encouraged to use lower capacity roadways?
I think there's a delicate balance. I like traffic calming when it's done right. When it's not done right, as a bicyclist, I really can't stand it because it really tends to affect me, you know, I think probably as much or more than the drivers. I think there's kind of a delicate balance to traffic flow and traffic flow at appropriate speeds. And I think that in neighborhoods where there are children, somebody mentioned that earlier, I think it is important to do what we can, and that may be narrowing the roadway in some cases. People drive slowly and more carefully when the roadway is narrower. And in some cases, it may be a cruder development, such as the speed hump. I think we need to get more sophisticated about traffic calming. We really haven't done it except in the last decade on any large scale. I think it's important, though, that we have traffic moving at appropriate speeds that are safe for people in the neighborhood and that make people feel comfortable walking there.
Okay, Don asks, in a sprawling region such as ours, would you say that focusing on strengthening existing neighborhood centers would be the best strategy for enhancing sustainability and livability? Or is there a more effective way to do this?
Well, I'm a huge proponent of strengthening existing neighborhood centers and existing neighborhood places. I think that in almost all cases, that's a great way to go.
All right, 2 more questions. Dorothy asked, can changes to zoning regulations regarding farming activities in urban areas further sustainable communities, such as allowing gardens and chickens, etc.?
That gets kind of tricky, doesn't it? You know, I mean, I love the idea of vegetables being grown in my neighborhood. I'm not so sure about pigs, you know, so I think that's for each neighborhood to decide, and I think some neighborhoods may be more hospitable to livestock within reason than others. Me, I'm more of a vegetable guy.
All right, and the last question is, can we buy a copy of your book here today?
That's really setting me up. I love that
Oh,
question.
please say yes.
On one of the tables near the registration desk, there is a sample copy of my book. There are also some flyers for the book there. It's available on Amazon and available in other places, and I would love for all of you to buy a copy of my book. Thank you so much for your time.
Let's
and I
give a
hope you have
warm
great day.
welcome. Thank you. Thank you, Cade.